Looking at the vintage 2022, both for Mount Beautiful, North Canterbury, and also for New Zealand, on the back of what was an exceptionally low vintage for New Zealand in 2021, and in combination with that, the world and New Zealand were under this COVID challenge, which essentially was a labour supply issue, as well as New Zealand being in lockdown and trying to manage staffing from an internal point of view was very difficult. Certainly 2021, just to quickly recap, was incredibly low through very severe frost throughout New Zealand. I think our tonnage was down by at least half of what it traditionally had been in 2021, so the supply was extremely short. And while the vintage quality was excellent, the volumes were very low. So everyone was very much hoping that 2022 was going to be a more bountiful year. The season started off very well. When I talk about season, I'm talking September, October, November, which is the spring time in New Zealand. We can be exposed to a lot of frost at that time of the year, and thankfully, we didn't get nearly as many. We had a few, but not too many, and none of them were deliberating compared to what they were the previous year. So going into flowering, which is typically around the November-December period in New Zealand, and we had some pretty warm weather. Flowering was really, really promising, and so the potential yields were looking great. The spring into early summer carried on really well. We had some lovely hot weather, a little bit of rainfall, but getting through into the end of January, everything was looking very good. In fact, everyone was projecting and anticipating that our harvest would be, probably easily 10 days ahead of normal, which was a bit worrying. Everyone's a bit concerned about climate change and where that was going. So 10 days early would have put some of the earlier harvesting for New Zealand anyway into the end of February, early March, which would be unprecedented. Come the end of January though, we ended up with a really unusual weather pattern, and really what the whole east coast of New Zealand, which is largely where the grape growing regions are, was covered in quite high cloud, and we didn't get a lot of clear sunshine days through the east coast of New Zealand, which then just slowed down the growing degree days. It slowed down the ripening process. Everything kept getting pushed out, and we were sort of then getting to that point of being worried about actually when would this harvest begin. On top of that, the yields did come through really strongly, got to veraison into mid to late January, early February, depending on the regions, and sure enough, the yields were pretty bountiful. And at that time, going through veraison, we did end up with a reasonable amount of rain falling across New Zealand. Perfect timing at veraison from a filling out of the berry perspective. So what New Zealand experienced was some larger than normal berries, bigger bunches, and our overall crop was ultimately in the end was significantly up on both historic and significantly up on 2021. I think it was up 30 or 40% up on 2021, which was remarkable. Nevertheless, what it has done is it's allowed New Zealand to refill the pipeline, because there were tanks were empty, shipping lines were empty, warehouses were empty, retail shelves were empty. So a good sized vintage out of New Zealand has allowed us to restock and refulfill where we are on a global basis. So the vintage was, talked about the cloud, that really delayed ripening. It meant that the sugars weren't ripening as quickly as we thought they were. Certainly the acids were holding up a bit more, and we were getting periods of rainfall coming through, which sort of caused the odd challenge from a picking decision perspective. And from a New Zealand angle, they had a reasonable amount of rain in Hawke's Bay, which put a bit of pressure on the white wines, some rain in Marlborough as well, which again further compacted and impacted the harvest period. From a North Canterbury Mount Beautiful perspective, we were probably around 2 weeks later than normal from a picking perspective. Normally we would be picking into sort of mid to back end of March. This year the first pick wasn't until about the 7th or 8th of April, but it was then incredibly short. So our last pick was on the 23rd or 24th of April, so it was a really compact, really short window of picking that took place. And leading into that beginning of picking in April, I was really worried that we weren't going to get the sugars. I was really worried that the acids was holding up really high and just sort of what we were going to get. And then we had this, really nice window of perhaps a 10-day window at the back end of March into early April, which just allowed everything the switch to flick. And we went from being I was concerned about acids and Brixes to suddenly both of those popping up, as in Brixes increasing, acidity's dropping, and suddenly we started to get some flavour coming through, and like, hey presto, we could start to see what we were going to get ahead of us. So it was a really nice feeling to know that yes, we'd hit that point where the flavours were coming, the Brix and the pH and the TAs were starting to align with where you'd like to think they were going to be, and then we're starting to see some flavours, the berries were softening up, and at that point I was able to then start to work through each of the blocks and work through which we thought was going to be suitable from a black label point of view or from a white label point of view, both in the Pinot Noir and the Sauvignon Blanc. But this was my first vintage working at Mount Beautiful, and it's the most beautiful setting. Vineyard, it's set in these undulating hills and plains, and you've got these beautiful aspects that look out over the yonder and into the hills beyond. And but every block, every variety does tend to throw up different flavours and different profiles, which really adds to the complexity and the intrigue that I think Mount Beautiful can offer. It took a little bit of time for me, and that's really what I spent my time doing, was walking the rows, tasting the grapes, and trying to work out which clone, which block were going to work together, because our Pinot yields were on the lighter side, our Sauvignon yields were nicely in balance, and so in order to fill the Pinot tanks, I needed to identify, it wasn't just by clone or by block, I was actually going through block by block and looking at clone by clone, and then working out which ones were going to be had the right physiological ripening flavour collectively, that I could then put together to then create and fill a fermenter from a Pinot Noir point of view. So that was really interesting. So essentially the blending's been done in the vineyard. We've got mixed clones, we've got mixed blocks across the Mount Beautiful vineyard, and ultimately, I think we're going to actually end up with something that's going to have a bit more intrigue, going to have some a bit of a point of difference about it, because we've co-fermented all these clones from different blocks together right from day one. And there's a lot of philosophy and there's a lot of talk about co-fermenting clones, and perhaps adds a bit more complexity down the line. So it'll be interesting to see whether that comes out, because the traditional approach is you keep a clone separate and a block separate, and then ferment them on their own, and then look at the blending down the line. So this will be an interesting test. I won't say experiment, but a test in terms of what we've got, and what I saw from a fruit point of view, from a flavour point of view, and then post-fermentation, I think is actually really exciting. So maybe going forward, we do co-ferment some of those blocks together again. We've also made a rosé out of some of these Pinot Noir blocks, and I was very much in the view that it needed to be a lighter coral pink, salmon pink type colour, really attractive on the eye. It was dry, close to dry, nice fruit, but textural and flavoursome, and we identified again multiple blocks of Pinot Noir, different clones, and fermented those together. But we've also got a small amount of Pinot Gris, around just over 11% Pinot Gris in the blend as well, and the Pinot Gris is going to bring out a little bit of perfume, I think, into the wine. So it's really nice colour, it's got a nice drinkability to it, nice freshness, nice acidity, and I think will be an interesting rosé. The Sauvignon Blanc was relatively short in terms of its picking window. We were probably over a 2 week, maybe 2.5 week window in terms of picking all of our Sauvignon Blanc, and each of the clones and each of the blocks offer something a little bit different. So like the Pinot Noir, spent quite a bit of time in each of these blocks trying to identify which flavour profile of that block was going to be better at white label or more suited to the black label. How do those nuances work? How do we align the two? And again, we managed to keep blocks and clones largely separate, which was great, because that helped from a blending point of view, and it just helped me in terms of understanding what each of the blocks can do. And I think that what Mount Beautiful can offer from a Sauvignon point of view is something that's very different from a Marlborough perspective. The flavour profiles, there's a New Zealandness to the wine, but it's got this lovely minerality that runs through it. There's an elegance that runs through the wine. There's your classic snow pea, tomato leaf, tropical passion fruit sort of flavours coming through underneath it all, and it's got a real nice association, I think, that steps it apart from being just your very fruity New Zealand Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc to something that's got a little bit more intrigue, perhaps a little bit of salinity, a little sort of saltiness in it, which then brings this beautiful salivating aspect to it. And I think that what North Canterbury and Cheviot can offer from a Sauvignon perspective is really exciting. And then we've also made a small amount of Chardonnay, which I super love Chardonnay. I really love that as a wine to drink. And what we've done this year is fermented it all in barrel. A high proportion of it is using a wild yeast or natural yeast, which I think helps enhance character and texture and intrigue into that wine. And largely that's all just sitting in barrel, waiting for spring, waiting for malolactic fermentation to kick in. But no, that's all looking good. And then the other variety that we've made is a Riesling, and Mount Beautiful have 3 very nice little Riesling blocks there. Lime, lemon, mandarin. It's just got heaps of flavour to it, great acidity. And so this particular Riesling from 2022, we stopped it with about 10 grams of residual, but given the acidity on a Riesling scale, it's probably just off dry in terms of flavour. So it's got this nice little sweetness in the mid palate, but with a nice long dry finish to it. So I think the balance actually looks really good in that area. So that's sort of the Mount Beautiful North Canterbury sort of vintage overview. New Zealand, as I mentioned, a bit more trickier in the North Island, and then as you move south it got easier and easier, less rain. The temperatures are a bit more amenable. Central Otago, they didn't get the rain, but they had very hot temperatures. Their yields were pretty big. In fact, their tonnages were big, and so their challenge was actually balancing flavour ripeness with high Brix levels. So every region in New Zealand, I think, had its challenges, but through the years of learning what we do, how we go about it, the wine quality, I think, will be distinctively New Zealand, and everyone will be pretty happy that the tanks are full, the barrels are full, and the quality is sound.